Well, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to our second week lecture on business and its environment. Today we're looking at business power. Now, one of the assigned items you have for this week is to view the ABC John Stossel documentary um, called Greed. It's a 45-minute film, and I think you're really going to enjoy it because it really drills down on the term greed. Is greed a good thing for America? And so I think you're really going to enjoy the film, and I've been showing it in all my classes for years, so I think you'll get a big kick out of it. Now, the quiz that you have for this week will also include questions about the movie. So pay attention because there'll be some assessment questions there for you. So we are looking in this particular chapter at the power of corporations. Obviously, we're talking about large, companies that have the power to change society through the company's actions. And so, as illustrations or platforms for discussion, we're going to be looking at the American Tobacco Company, the railroads, which were really big in the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. And then we're going to be looking at Mr. J.P. Morgan, who was quite a financier, and of course the Standard Oil Company. So I think you will find this an interesting conversation. At least that's my hope. So let's go back to my friend, the French philosopher Voltaire, who observed, before you address me, define your terms. So what do we mean by business power, which is the title for Chapter 3 in this week's conversation? Well, business power simply is the force behind an act of a company, an industry, or a sector. Some people could call it raw, unadulterated power. Okay, but it's an ability to force action one way or another. And where does this authority or power come from? Well, ultimately, it comes from our society, right? And that we have this thing that we call the social contract, that society believes that we will give business authority to act in exchange for the rightful use of power. Let me say that again. Society's social contract with business is that society gives business a significant authority to act in exchange for the rightful use of that power. So, of course, when it's exercised appropriately, or like, as we like to say, rightfully, in keeping with the social contract and its intent, well, then good things result for society. And, of course, business as well. But mere might does not equate to right by any stretch of the imagination. So our author, Mr. Steiner, uses James B. Duke as an illustration of a business entrepreneur who capitalized on the new technology of the bond sack machine to increase the output of cigarettes. So just as Henry Ford introduced the assembly line in order to produce Model Ts quicker and faster and more efficiently than any competitor in the market, and I'm always reminded of that Henry Ford observation. You can have a Model T Ford in any color you want as long as it's black. But he was into efficiency, and so was James Duke. in terms of using the Bonsack machine to mass produce cigarettes. Now, of course, back in those days, when people were smoking pipes and cigars and whatnot, of course, uh, the medical issues of um, the use of tobacco were not known. It wasn't really until the 1950s and 60s that significant medical research became available that obviously informed the public that, hey, look, smoking can be hazardous to your health. Excessive smoking could be even more hazardous. President Ulysses S. Grant, and there's a great book out now simply called Grant by Ron Chernow, and I recommend it to you. It's a lengthy book. It's about 1,100 pages. But Grant was an incessant cigar smoker. Like, he would smoke 15 to 20 cigars a day. Can you believe that? And it eventually killed him. He developed, cancer of the throat, cancer of the tongue, and it eventually, killed him in the 1870s. So, but in this time era, the hazard of smoking wasn't well known. In fact, I can recall when I entered the Army in 1976, our C rations, our food packages that we would have distributed to us when we were in the field, contained cigarette packages containing 3 cigarettes. Again, the tobacco trying to keep soldiers awake when they were in the field, and so our C ration packages contained cigarettes. So, times change. Research obviously educates and informs us, but in this day and time, Duke was essentially creating a monopoly with his use of the Bonsack machine. But like some other examples that we're going to talk about in just a moment, we have the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 that eventually was used by the Supreme Court to break up the Duke monopoly on tobacco around 1911. And we're going to see that the Sherman Antitrust Act was also used to break up other types of trusts, such as those that belonged to J.P. Morgan involving the railroads, and of course John Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. And you'll recall from history, hopefully you remember, that President Teddy Roosevelt really gained a tremendous reputation for busting up trusts, monopolies that were out there at the time. So I think we can probably get a consensus that, look, corporate power does impact society in a number of ways. And just looking at 2 levels, on a surface level, what's the direct, cause of visible immediate changes? So what did Standard Oil or the railroads, what were they able to do with their power? Well, they were able to do a lot with their power. So, for example, the railroads, when they obtained right-of-ways from over government land, one of the things that the government provided the railroads was that they would, like a checkerboard, squares on each side of the railroad track, the railroad would be given a certain amount of those checkerboard square tracks as an incentive, obviously, for railroads to invest money in building railroads from, coast to coast. Now, on a much deeper, level, we can see that, society has been changed over time through foreseeable and unforeseeable, changes. The cigarette industry is a good example of a case in point, where our society has been significantly affected in health ways as a result of smoking, and so society has responded to that with not only mandatory warnings on cigarette packages, but you notice there aren't any cigarette commercials on television these days. Well, that's prohibited. And so the Surgeon General and other entities have sought to reduce the use of tobacco because it obviously increases health problems and health costs. So the author argues that, look, there are 7 ways that corporate power gets exercised today. And so the first sphere, if you will, of corporate power is simply economic power that comes through the use of property and resources to influence events and people. So we can see how David Duke, was able to create a monopoly for American tobacco, and John Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. You could see how these folks created monopolies as well in the 19th century. Well, of course, technological change is another influence on business, and that, as we've seen with a number of companies. So let's take Google, Amazon, Microsoft, for example. We would all concede that those companies have had an enormous influence on the direction, rate, and characteristics and consequences of innovations. They've been big-time technological leaders. And that certainly has affected our lives, right? I am forever amazed, how students no longer talk to each other. They just look at their iPhones. I was at Washington State University last summer and saw these 15 students outside the Student Union building. They were sort of gathered together, but they weren't talking to one another. All 15 were looking at their iPhones. And I thought, wow, what a shame they're not sharing with one another communication that is direct and personal. So I walked up to the group of 15 and said, "Hi, how is everybody?" And they all looked at me startled because they had somehow lost the means of direct oral communication. So technological power can certainly influence behavior. Political power certainly involves the ability to influence governments. And I like to point out that to every action, there is a reaction by government. So when we have misconduct on the part of business, then the government reacts. So let's go back to the year 2000, for example. So we had, over 2,000 publicly traded companies that decided they were going to restate their earnings. Now, what does it mean to restate a company's earnings? You ought to know this. So hopefully in your graduate accounting course, you learned that essentially restating earnings means, oops, we got the numbers wrong. Now imagine 2,000 publicly traded companies restating their earnings in one year, 2001. What impact might that have on the markets? Might there be tremendous suspicion about the veracity or integrity of the numbers? Well, if 2,000 companies are coming out saying they got their numbers wrong, well, how do we value anything? And what about the new numbers that they're providing? Are they any more correct than the prior numbers that were provided? And so as a consequence, we had a loss of 500 points in the stock market in less than a week in July of 2001. And so what happened as a result of this, oops, we got our numbers wrong? We got Sarbanes-Oxley that was enacted by Congress at warp speed. In January 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley comes into existence, creating all sorts of new regulatory requirements on business. So, for example, CFOs and CEOs were now required to personally sign, that is, authenticate all reports and documents going to the SEC and other governmental agencies. And of course, there were penalties for CEOs and CFOs for incorrect data. And so as a consequence, if you were a CEO or a CFO, how willing would you be to sign some financial report that one of your subordinates puts in front of you that could result in criminal liability? And so as a consequence, we call this the Full Employment Act for accountants, the accounting industry exploded in terms of hiring because business wanted to make cotton picking sure that whatever data they provided to the SEC and other governmental agencies was correct. And so Sarbanes-Oxley brought that about. Well, what happened in 2008? Well, we had this thing called the mortgage bubble, right? And we saw property values decrease. Well, the way it got started, of course, is we had mortgages that were being given, being approved for home buyers that shouldn't have been. Shoot, you didn't need to put anything down. You could roll the closing costs into the purchase price. And so people would wait, several months, maybe even a year until the property increased in value, because property values in those days only went up. They never stayed the same or went down. And then, of course, people would flip their homes at that time and, sell and, make money on the deal and start again until the bubble burst. And, of course, property values went down as far as at least 40% in California, not to mention Florida. And so, obviously, we had a lot of problems on Wall Street, right? Not to mention AIG and Merrill Lynch and others who got themselves in all sorts of big-time trouble. And the result being Dodd-Frank was enacted by Congress, again, at fairly warp speed. So you can see, I think, tangible change as a result of the exercise of political power, that to every action there is a reaction by a government. And so business needs to be cautious and insightful when it makes decisions. And then a fourth sphere of influence is, of course, legal power, the ability to shape laws and regulations. So the Citizens United case that went to the Supreme Court, where business argued that they had a legitimate right to spend money advocating political positions or opposition thereto, and that they could give virtually unlimited amounts of money to PACs, political action committees, and candidates. And the Supreme Court agreed that yes, the government's attempt to try and restrict that influence by limiting the amount of money business could give was found to be unconstitutional. Certainly, cultural power has influence over values, habits, and institutions. We see that certainly in celebrity marketing, right, and advertising. Environmental power. Obviously, environmental laws are significant and affect business in a variety of ways. And so business has to think through, clearly what impact on the environment its actions are going to have, because there are governmental rules that govern business behavior with respect to the environment. One of my favorite ones that I always advise people to be sensitive to is when business is buying real estate property, one of the standard operating cautionary actions a business is going to want to take is to, before you purchase the property, or if you do purchase it, buy it contingent upon it successfully passing an environmental study. Now, I'm not talking about an environmental impact statement, but an environmental study to check and make sure that the land does not contain toxic waste or other environmental hazards. Because under the law, if you buy property that subsequently turns out to have toxic or environmental waste on it, guess what? You own the problem. And when you try and find the buyer the seller who sold you this property, I bet you the odds are excellent you won't find them, or they'll be in bankruptcy. And so environmental power is something that certainly influences business behavior, as it should. Power over individuals. Certainly employees, managers, stockholders, consumers, citizens, people we refer to often as stakeholders. Business influences. So when business decides to move, wow, how many employees and managers are going to move, with the company from point A to point B? So yes, these are all things that affect business. Now, these are some influences about business that should give us pause to think and consider. One of the positions or arguments that is made is what's called the dominance theory, that business power is preeminent in American society, that it is in fact excessive in nature and not adequately checked. What do you think? Is that a true or false statement, do you think? Consumer advocate Ralph Nader argues that corporations are the most pernicious entities in America, that business is inadequately regulated and that it takes advantage of the public based on the dominance. And certainly we can argue that what occurred in 2000, 2001, and 2008, 2009 certainly would give credence to that, argument that, good heavens, business was out of control, and looked at the damage that it did to the economy. So that is an argument that he makes. Bernie Sanders, Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, makes a similar argument, saying that, look, you've got 1% of the country owning over 50% of assets. Dominance theory. Is he right? Is he wrong? Well, he argues that there's this corporate elite. Is there a pattern of Ivy League graduates, for example, from Ivy League schools in the Northeast that occupy pinnacles of corporate power? About 10, 12 years ago, I did some research on the issue of companies that had gotten themselves into one form of trouble or another, looking at their CEOs to see what schools the CEOs had attended with respect to, I was trying to get a feel for ethics. Was there a pattern of CEOs and CFOs graduating from Ivy League institutions that seemed to demonstrate ethical problems? So my study, I looked at 50 CEOs and CFOs, and I found a pattern. And when I submitted my article for publication, I remember the journal saying, "We can't print that. You need to delete the schools that these people attended. I mean, this will cause a row. You've only got 50 people here. You would need to have done a study of at least 1,000 or 2,000 CEOs in order to be able to make those types of claims." Well, perhaps more CEOs and CFOs should have been included in the article. But it is odd, I found it at least interesting, that there seemed to be a pattern of schools that these CEOs and CFOs attended, that somehow, these corporate giants didn't get the message regarding ethics. So there is that argument, and certainly Senator Bernie Sanders continues to make the argument of what he calls the economic elites that are governing this this country. Now, that's the dominance theory. The pluralist theory says, look, you know, the United States is a pluralistic society, right? And so business power and its exercise is checked by our democratic values, by our Constitution, our federal and state laws, certainly markets themselves, government, labor unions, advocacy groups, public opinion. Oh, heavens. We've got lots of pluralist checks on business power and its exercise. True or false? What do you think? Well, it's an interesting question. I like to go back in history to the Constitutional Convention of May of 1787. So going way back then, you recall what happened? You should recall that, good heavens, there was a problem with our new 13 states. They really couldn't do business with each other. So let me give you an example. So you have this farmer who grows corn in Georgia, and he wants to sell his corn in New York. So he loads up his wagon or wagons with corn, and he motors up to from Georgia to South Carolina. But when he gets to the border in South Carolina, the South Carolinians want him to pay a toll tax. But he's got to pay the toll tax in South Carolina currency, not Georgia currency, because there was no federal currency at the time. Okay, assume for the moment he somehow gets his hands on that, and he motors to North Carolina. They have a toll tax too, and they want to get paid in North Carolina currency. And you can begin to see a pattern. So by the time he reaches Virginia, and from Virginia to Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania to New Jersey, by the time he gets to New York, has he been very successful? He's been taxed to death. He's got to come up with many different types of currency. You can see, look, I think there was a problem among the 13 states being able to do commerce with one another. And so all you have to do, I think, is take a look at who attended. Who did the states send to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in May 1787 to ostensibly amend the Articles of Confederation? But of course, when they all got in there behind closed doors and they shut the windows and everything else, they all agreed one thing was true. The Articles of Confederation were beyond help. They needed a new system of government in order to get the country operational from a governing point of view. So who went? Well, we got John Adams, business lawyer from Massachusetts, right? George Washington, an agribusiness farmer from Virginia. Ben Franklin, a publisher and inventor from Philadelphia. Alexander Hamilton, banker from New York. John Jay, banker from New York. Take a look at who all of the representatives were from the states, and you'll discover one fascinating common characteristic. They were all business people. And so is it a mystery why the Commerce Clause got into Article 1 of the Constitution? So business and government, of course, have worked together for a very long time. And so the pluralist theory says, look, all these things together certainly influence business and its conduct. So certainly governments and laws regulate business, as we know only too well. There are lots of social interest groups out there that exercise restraint on businesses, from boycotts to media campaigns. You can see them on television all the time. And of course, we know social values do restrain managers from taking certain actions. They may want to build something somewhere, and the local community may not agree. That's not unusual to have petitions submitted in communities to have land rezoned so it can't be used for a business, purpose. So another influence is that, corporate power does remain accountable to democratic controls. What do you think? True or false? I mean, certainly what happened in 2000, 2001, and 2008, 2009 would give us pause to wonder about that, whether or not there are sufficient democratic controls to influence a business. Well, we've got, the example of John Rockefeller in Standard Oil, who ran a pretty competitive, monopolistic operation. And of course, all business would like to be monopolists. Who likes competition? If you have the choice between being a monopolist and having to compete, I think a lot of folks would say, well, it's a lot easier to be a monopolist. That's true. But, he ran his oil business in such a way that he was able to actually lower costs for transportation on things such as ships and lights. One of my favorite stories is the story about oil lamps, kerosene lamps. Standard Oil gave away free oil lamps to Eskimos in Alaska. Now, why would Standard Oil give away kerosene lamps free of charge to Eskimos? They would have to buy the kerosene in order to light up the lights, right? And what would the lights do for the Eskimos? Clearly, it enabled them to stay up later. They could, work later. They could read. And so that certainly was an interesting business strategy that, worked for selling oil in Alaska. So are ethical, issues raised by the conduct of John Rockefeller? He certainly was engaged in earnest, I'm being kind, competition, but where his monopolistic behavior was that ethical, and did that respond adequately to the social contract? Well, perhaps, depends on your point of view, but I think you have to look at it in a historical context. That is, at the time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, was this competitive form of behavior, common? And I think, this exercise of economic power certainly was common. So I think we can see that this competition, and certainly Rockefeller's Standard Oil, produced a lot of positive things, but certainly some negative things as well. But again, look at this company and its operations in a historical context. When we talk about technological power with respect to him, wow, we're talking about obviously change. And I think in his book, Future Shock, Alvin Toffler makes the point, the only thing that is constant in society is change. And I think that's very true. And so certainly John Rockefeller leveraged technological power in order to bring his prices down and to essentially create himself a monopoly because he out-competed his competitors. What about his political power? Certainly the way he did business corrupted politicians by giving them large campaign contributions in return for favors. One doesn't give money in politics without a purpose behind the gift. They are not considered charitable contributions. So certainly over a period of time, and certainly with the advent of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, this type of behavior over a period of time became unacceptable. So while earlier it was acceptable and pronounced, as time went on, society's values and expectations changed. And so we can see that with the enactment of the Sherman Antitrust Act, that the Supreme Court used as the basis for its decision in 1911 to break up Standard Oil, certainly against its wishes, was an exercise of legal power, because society had changed, expectations had changed, the social contract had changed, and so Rockefeller and Standard Oil's conduct or behavior practices were no longer acceptable. So certainly his cultural power over a period of time changes things, just like environmental power does. Certainly there were things that emanated from Standard Oil that over a period of time came into conflict with the social contract. So while on the one hand, the reason why the monopoly grew was because there was demand and need, and certainly competition that brought about business behavior that was more profitable. Over a period of time, it came into conflict with the social contract. So while it dominated its markets in the beginning, later on, labor unions, socialists, progressives, pressure groups initially had little impact on this large company. But again, as its business methods came into conflict with the social contract involving fair play and competition, guess what? The Supreme Court intervenes, enforces the social contract against Standard Oil, and breaks it up into much smaller companies like Exxon Mobil, right? So the dominance theory can explain the early days of Standard Oil and why it was able to do what it did. However, as the decade passed, public expectations and the social contract evolved, changed, and came into conflict with this business behavior. Is that different from today? Well, I think today we have pluralistic society that certainly brings business to respond to public demands for reform. So certainly Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank are illustrations of that. So this leads to ask the interesting question, because of Rockefeller's religious principles, he seemed to act differently in business than he did with respect to his religious values. How could he be both a Christian and a ruthless monopolist at the same time? One would deduce, wow, that sounds like that ought to be in conflict. He certainly didn't apply his Christian values or beliefs in his business dealings. He was somehow able to compartmentalize and separate those two, which you can understand. Again, he was a man of the times, late 19th century, early 20th century, and in those days, values and the social contract were different. So in those days, the Puritan ethic and the Protestant work ethic held that, look, if you worked at those things, you would be rewarded by riches. And riches were a sign that God Almighty approved of your enterprise over idleness, productivity, over waste, and progress over decay. Well, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that was a common business and ethical perception. And so people were able to compartmentalize those two very different perspectives. So, yeah, when you look at how religious John Rockefeller was, and he actually left the vast majority of his estate to a 501c3 foundation that exists even to this very day, even though he read the Bible every day, he was able to compartmentalize and separate out business from his Christian beliefs. So this brings us to conflict, and of course, ultimately, Rockefeller's business ethics came into conflict with the social contract, and the social contract via the Supreme Court required Standard Oil to be broken up into smaller companies so that their monopoly was destroyed, and the company had to be more responsive to public expectations. And so, yes, the trust's fatal mistake was that it failed to see the evolution of the social contract and to respond accordingly. Business as usual has its limitations. So, when asking the question in a utilitarian sense, was Standard Oil Company a net plus or a minus? Well, at the time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was meeting society's expectations. But it's like shooting a moving target. Those changed over time, and when they did, Standard Oil should have changed or anticipated the evolution or paid closer attention, but it didn't. But did Standard Oil produce positives, good things? Well, certainly it produced standardized distillates that were less likely to explode than competing brands. They stabilized, Standard Oil stabilized oil prices in most areas. It developed facilities and production technology, jobs, payrolls, tax revenues for government. And it certainly produced wealth that enabled Rockefeller to engage in philanthropy. So it probably, in the long run, was a positive for Rockefeller and Standard Oil, that they contributed a great deal to society. And I think that is subject to debate as to how much the contribution was compared to the wealth generated and controlled by Rockefeller and company. But it certainly does bring forth the question, well, look, Rockefeller engaged in a number of unethical practices, and that that makes his business ethics tainted. And it certainly brings up what I consider to be an interesting ethical question. Would we honor the work of a burglar who broke into a house, stole a large sum, and gave it to a worthy charity where it helped many people? What we call the Machiavellian ethics. That is, do the ends justify the means? So for all the earlier things we looked at with Rockefeller, do the ends that he created, are they justified by the means of monopoly, corruption, and some of the other things he did? And I think that's an interesting, question. But once you start down the ends justify the means road, I think that's a slippery slope ethically, especially in today's world. Do the ends sought justify the means used? I think that is a very difficult challenge that one should try and avoid, because I'm not a believer in the Machiavellian system of ethics. I like the utilitarian principle of ethics of seeking the greatest good. Also, Immanuel Kant's approach with universalism, that a proposed course of action is good, providing everybody else could take a similar course of action. My favorite one is the one from Norman Vincent Peale, former Archbishop of Canterbury, who said in any ethical situation you should ask yourself three questions. The first question being, is it ethical? If you can get past that first, is it legal? Is it legal? That's the first question that Norman Vincent Peale would ask. And if it's clearly unlawful, then you should not proceed. But assume for the moment the action, let's say, of moving a company from the United States overseas to create a sweatshop situation in order to increase the bottom line. Yeah, that would be legal. But the second question he suggests you ask yourself is it fair or balanced? Is it fair or balanced, the proposed course of action? Well, that may depend, but moving jobs overseas, I think most people would say, has negative effects in the United States. The third question that Peale would pose is, so how does it make you feel about shutting down your business and moving it overseas to create a sweatshop situation in Southeast Asia? So those three questions, the ethical questions, I think are the ones that I think can help, like a compass, get us going in the direction of rectitude, that is, correctness. Is the proposed course of action legal? Is it fair or balanced? How does it make me feel? And with that, boys and girls, I want to invite your email questions that you may have on this subject or any others, because Professor Huckster is open for business. And I'll try and get back with you at least within 24 hours during the weekdays. So with that, thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to continued intellectual Olympics. Bye-bye.